Welcome to Soul Issue. I'm Nick Williams. With important elections on the way and a community in need, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure that our voters are making the best choices for representation and that our representatives are making the best choices for our voters. I spoke with local community organizer Jeffery Bulls, president of the Saginaw CAP organization, about making progress and some of the tensions that come with doing that work. I'm here with Jeffery Bulls of Saginaw CAP. Jeffery, first things first, just let everybody know what CAP does and what you do as the president of CAP.
So Saginaw CAP, Community Alliance for the People, we call it Saginaw CAP for short. It's a community advocacy organization. We represent the community in a number of ways, environmental issues, social justice issues, criminal justice issues, and the like. Anything that the community is about, we're about.
Okay, what are the issues that you think are kind of at the forefront facing Saginaw currently? What do you think we might need to work on the most?
I think the biggest thing, and that's where we come in, is there's a large segment of the population that is mostly ignored when it comes to policy discussions and other discussions like economic empowerment, business, the business community. A lot of those conversations leave a large swath of the community out of those conversations, and we try to bring the community back into them.
What's the first step for your average everyday person? And people are busy, they got all kinds of distractions, you got your everyday life, you got your kids to take care of. How do we get people back into advocating for themselves politically and understanding the importance of that aspect of their community?
Well, I think first of all, you have to make civics tangible. You have to connect the people to the issues. A lot of times, we're working, we're taking care of our family, and that doesn't leave a lot of time to focus on, kitchen table issues like policy down at City Hall. A lot of people are kind of disenchanted with the process as well. And so we make that connection to bring people back in, to let them know that politics and public policy does affect them. And whether they care about it or not, it affects them.
Where do you think this disconnect started? Because I do sense a growing disconnect, not just here, but in general, of communities and the people who are supposed to represent them. How do you think that gap widens so much?
Well, because frankly, we put the wrong people in office. And those wrong people have focused on business interests and moneyed interests, wealthy interests, rather than the issues with the people. And so the people have seen that for a number of years, and after a while, you get disenchanted with the process. You feel like your voice doesn't matter, especially if you constantly see your elected officials give more credence to those who have money versus those who don't.
So this past week, Saginaw had its yearly community meeting for Martin Luther King Jr. Day. It was about the state of Black Saginaw. Mm-hmm. It looked like a very fruitful meeting. Unfortunately, I couldn't attend, but I watched the whole thing online. But I did notice not only at the meeting, but some of the responses. I noticed our local CBS affiliate, there were a lot of negative comments. How do we create understanding about the difference of need in a white population versus a black population? Because I was seeing a lot of misunderstanding about why a meeting for the black population would be necessary, and maybe even some obfuscation over, well, let's make it about everybody or something like that. I mean, how do we relieve those tensions without uh, forfeiting our stance?
Well, I think understanding, number one. I often make the comparison. If your church has a meeting, other churches don't feel left out because this church is meeting about that church's issues. I'd even go a little bit farther in bringing it back to race or ethnicity. Other ethnicities, Latinos and other entities, they meet all the time. They have their issues centered all the time. It only seems to be when black people meet that it seems to be tension. And that's something that I'll probably never understand. It doesn't really motivate me much because I just, we have to focus on what we need to do. And so, although, we do offer a olive branch, nobody's they're not turned away from the meeting. So anybody could show up. We just center what's happening in the black community. And I think it's fair to do so.
What were the moments in your life that led you to this place as a community organizer? What did you see growing up in this community that made this your life's passion?
Men like my grandfather. I grew up in a very strong male-led home and family, and my grandfather was the head of that. And I had that example. Someone who led his family with a strong hand, and also, cared about his community, cared about his church, cared about his workplace. He was a GM retiree. And so, having that type of example of someone who not only cared about his community, but actually put sweat equity into his community, that's something that sticks with you. When you see that example of somebody who cares whether trash is picked up in his community, cares whether his neighbor, if somebody pulls up in his neighbor's yard and he has something to say about it, hey, those people aren't home. That demonstrated, care for your block, your neighborhood, your community, stuck with me, and that's something that has carried me. It's frankly, something that I think about every day, that's what drives me. It really does, and I'm really proud to have come from a lineage of someone who cared about his community, and I hope to, do that for my children as well.
What do you remember from your grandfather's era that you wish you saw in today's era doing the work you do?
Being neighborly, and I still work in that in my community, the same community I grew up with, I work in, I live in. Just being neighbors. Caring about the person next to you, the door down, 2 doors down, 3 doors down. Caring about what happens, and not, I think we're in a time now where more people are more individualistic. As long as nothing is happening in my house, I could care less. And I think we need to shift it back to the community model where we care about our neighbors, because, whether we realize it or not, the moment your children leave your house, they're affected by the neighborhood that you're ignoring. And so I think we do good to get back to that.
Do you think that rise of individualism and that loss of neighborly understanding might also be feeding some of these racial misunderstandings?
Yeah, I think so, because we're disjointed. In times past, even if you had disagreements, even if you had differences, you had opportunities to commingle. Whether you work with these people, or whether you went to church with them, or whether you saw them at the corner store or at the gas station. Again, a community, people being neighborly. I'm sure, in times past that everybody didn't get along, everybody didn't see eye to eye all the time. But I think there's a common thread that, hey, whether I like you or not, you're my neighbor. And what happens to your house, what happens in your yard, it could spill over into what happens in my yard. And so it's best that we look out for each other.
We have a primary election coming in February. What would you like to see Saginaw gain out of this upcoming election?
A true champion. I think we've been missing that. We've been missing representation, period, by that seat being empty. But I think, just having someone in that seat who's actually from this community, who actually cares about this community, who could actually bring resources from Lansing back to this community, I think we've been missing that. And that's one of the major things that I think that we need once that seat gets filled.
With limited resources inside of the city itself, and maybe not everything going where it's most needed, how do we know when and where to get help from the outside?
I think it's a balancing act. I think there's and that's where civics comes into play. Knowing what's a local issue, knowing what's a county issue, knowing what's a state issue, and having the representatives in place that can meet those needs. I think everything leads back to civics. A lot of us don't know who does what and who has the responsibility of what. And so I think just having these community conversations with each other, bringing each other together to have these conversations, I think that's how we bridge the gap, especially the knowledge gap, the civics gap. And once you know better, you can advocate better.
Can you tell me about a project that you worked on maybe in the past year or so that gave you some pride in what you do in that regard?
Yes, actually, it's one that we're doing right now. In these last few months, we had the federal government shut down, politically. That was a tough thing, but in that decision, people were harmed. People were without food, without SNAP benefits, without WIC benefits, so on and so forth. And so that left a gap in our community where people were hungry. They were, a lot of people depend on, those benefits to get food to their families. And so with that gap, when our government shut down, we were able to bring together a citywide coalition, a food coalition of churches and nonprofits, and it's been a beautiful thing. People stepped up and met the need. And for the last 3 months, we've been able to bring people together, bring volunteers together, bring money together from those churches, purchase food, and give out free boxes of food to the community. And it's just been a great example of community, and it's one of those things that makes my heart proud.
What are your goals going into this year, especially since we're also heading into a midterm election?
Results. I think we've long talked about the problems that we have in the community. We know what the issues are, from whether it's health effects, whether it's criminal justice, whether a lot of our community lives in poverty. They live below the poverty line, or they're the Alice population, where they're the working poor. And so I think now in 2026, it has to be about results. It has to be about a demand from the people, a groundswell from grassroots organizations like ours and other organizations to actually push to get results from our elected officials and let them know that we're in charge and not moneyed interests. And so that's a goal of ours. That's probably our biggest goal this year, is really getting the community back into the fold of public policy conversations and actually picking the right leaders. That's a big goal for us.
How are we going, or how do you plan on attracting everyday people? And I guess as an add-on to that question, do you want? Is it also an age-based thing? Because I know a lot of people are trying to get younger and younger people to get involved and become a part of these movements.
Very, very focused on getting young people. I think they've been left out of the conversation. Frankly, us as adults, we haven't brought their interest into the conversation, or we will bring them instead of listening to them and bringing them to the conversation. I think that's something that we've sorely missed out on. And I think historically, we've dropped the ball. When you think back in the 50s and 60s, the Freedom Riders, and they were young people. They weren't people that are older like me. I'm almost 50. We need to bring our young people in. We need and that's a way that we show them how to take over. They're going to take over. Myself, I don't plan on doing a lot of this for long. And I think, we have to get to a place where we can hand our children and our grandchildren a better, America than we found. And I hope that, because we haven't done a good job of that. We've held on to leadership, way too long as older people. And that's something that I've gotten criticism for, speaking on, because a lot of our people, we haven't had leadership long, and so a lot of people feel like they need to hold on to it a lot because I just got it, and so but we have to transition. A lot of what we need to do in this community, a lot of what we need to do in organizing, and I'm an organizer to my heart. A lot of organizing is young people's work. They have the energy, they have the new ideas, they know the technology. A lot of us don't know the technology. And so I think there's a transition that has to happen in bringing our young people in. But our movement is everybody. It's young people, it's older people, because we can't discount the elders either. They have a lot of experience. They've seen a lot of this country, and a lot of the things that we're dealing with now, they've seen before. And so they know how to deal with it. And so we can't discount them either. But I think, with what we do with Saginaw CAP, we bring all of those entities together in a room and we talk about
it. One really interesting thing that was brought up at the meeting was somebody mentioned that the disparities in the African American community are such that you can read them in a way that anything that is negative is overrepresented in the black community, and things that are seemingly positive are underrepresented. And that that's essentially what we're trying to change. At the same time, America's getting a little strange. Things are obviously changing around here in a way that is making a lot of people uncomfortable, and maybe even worried about how things might trickle down, into our smaller communities, into smaller cities like Saginaw. I know this is a big question, but how do we keep the fight up while trying to keep all this other stuff at bay? We're trying to advance something while there's a big scary animal chasing us down.
I guess the statement I would give is to stay focused. Some fights are ours, some aren't. And that may be controversial to some, because some people feel like, black people, we fought for everything, and so why not be in these fights too? Every fight isn't ours. At some point we have to take care of home. At some point we have to look out for ourselves, and that's something that's really near and dear to me. I'm an independent voter. I don't do parties, and that's a whole nother show probably. But for the reason for me is that I believe in really looking out for self. We haven't looked out for self. Party politics doesn't lend itself to looking out for our own community. Oftentimes we're charged to put party over community. And that's something that I just don't fundamentally believe in. I believe that, we have to take charge of our communities in more ways than one. And one of those things is leaving party politics behind, and focusing on ourselves and what we need to do. Finally looking out for ourselves, number one.
Do you have any upcoming events or initiatives that you'd like to let the people know about, or that you're just excited about yourself to let everyone know about?
Well, our food giveaways are going to continue. We've been fortunate to get a lot of donations from our local churches, and so all of 2026 is funded. And so we're excited to continue to, we have a huge issue with food insecurity in our community, and so we're excited to continue to help our community however we can, and hopefully we can pick up the amount of giveaways that we do, and also just continuing to, our biggest staple, we call them CAP Talks. They're our monthly meetings that we have with the community. And so that's probably one of the biggest things that I'm excited about. I'm always excited about meeting with the community because I feel like the more that we come together and talk about issues, and not be siloed, because that's a huge issue. And I get it. A lot of us are, you're focused on your family, you're focused on working 1, 2, 3 jobs, and it can get convoluted. But anytime that we can come together and talk about the issues in the community, I feel like we progress as a community. So I'm excited about that.
If anybody wants to get involved in Saginaw CAP, how would they? What would be the first steps they should take?
First step is to go to our website. It's saginawcap.org. You can follow us on all social media, Facebook. I still call it Twitter. I think it's X now, and Instagram. It's all Saginaw CAP. And we reach out to us, email us. A lot of people reach out to us for volunteer opportunities, and so we're willing to bring people in, young people especially. I'm excited. I'm always excited to bring young people in to get a taste of public policy and how to really connect with their community. I think it's important.
Where are your CAP meetings held? Is it always the same location, or do you change it every time?
We move it around. We have a few different community partners. We try to live up to our name and be an alliance where we have partnerships with a number of entities in the community. Our State of Black Saginaw was at Saginaw CAC, but we partner with the Neighborhood House, First Ward, and other places. And then we have our home office downtown at SVRC Marketplace on the 2nd floor. That's where we have a lot of our meetings as well.
Where's the upcoming meeting next month for February happening?
It should be at our home office at SVRC downtown Saginaw.
Could you talk about some of the other staff members that you work with? Is there anybody that you'd like to highlight that you work with who's doing exemplary work?
Oh man, I have a great team. It's 6 of us, and we're all on the we're all the executive board. So of course my secretary is Imani Clark. My treasurer is Naisha Clark. Bishop Hurley Coleman is one of our founding members, and he's one of my biggest mentors. Somebody that that really means a lot to me. I actually I go to his church as well, and so and then Rosemary Dugan is another person that is with us. And so we have a really cool team, a really hardworking team. Not much capacity, which is typical of nonprofits, but we do everything that we want to do, and we get it done.
These CAP Talks that you do monthly, do they have a guest speaker like a TED Talk?
It varies. Sometimes we have a panel. Sometimes we have one guest speaker. Sometimes we have none. It depends on the topic. I'll give an example. Our juvenile justice CAP Talk, we had 3 local judges there. We had the Saginaw Defender's Office there. We had a few different people from the family court. So a lot of court administrators came out because they wanted to talk to the community. They don't get a chance to talk to the community, and I think that's what informs a lot of our work. We try to be that conduit between the people and either the government or the system, depending on the topic that we're talking about or the issue. And so a lot of our people in the community, a lot of their kids are caught up in the criminal justice system or the juvenile justice system or the family court, which includes the parents as well. And so there's a lot of issues in those systems that need to be addressed. And so for us to have those people, especially the judges, because they ultimately make a lot of the decisions. And so to have the decision makers in the room with the community, it was very powerful. We've had forums on housing, we've had forums on on criminal justice, juvenile justice, environmental issues. That we're heavily environmental. A lot of people don't know that we do a lot of environmental work statewide. We're partnering with the Sierra Club and other environmental organizations because a lot of what we deal with in our community is environmental. From the Saginaw River and the number of times that it's been polluted, by big industry. We're still dealing with the effects of that. And then of course, with GM having been in town and we have one, I think we had at our heyday, we had, I think 12 or 13 GM plants, and now we have one. But, those plants being gone, they left a lot behind. And that's something that a legacy that we're still dealing with environmentally. And so a lot of our work is rooted in environmental justice.
It's hard for the average person to make that connection, and I'm really glad that you're trying to lessen that gap, like I was talking about earlier, because there is a lot of miscommunication, and I do feel like some of it's too much for the average person, and that is why I think, like you were talking about, we need community. We need more people speaking to each other. It is a heavy load, but it's a lot lighter if we can all carry it together. So I deeply appreciate your contributions to our community, and I deeply appreciate you coming on this show. Thank you so much, Jeffery Bulls, for your time.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And make sure to click that bell icon to stay notified when we upload new content. Videos like this are only possible because of viewers like you. To help support this channel, click on the link in the description below. We'll see you next time.